All right, we're at the top of the hour, so I think it's time to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today on our session around powering optimization with Google Analytics 4 and Optimizely. My name is Nick Iyengar. I'll be hosting the session today. And we're really lucky to be joined today by a couple of really strong subject matter experts. We have Simon Chapman joining us from our partners at Optimizely. And we also have Collin Trudan, who manages the experience optimization team here at Merkle Cardinal Path. Let's go ahead and dive right in, take a quick look at the agenda, and then we'll do some housekeeping. So you can see here, we'll start with just some very quick background, just to set the stage. We'll talk about what the GA4 and Optimizely integration actually entails and why it's so important. Collin will take you through a bit of a tour of how the integration works and sort of give you the step-by-step breakdown of what you can expect. We'll get a quick peek at the roadmap, sort of what's coming down the pipeline from the Optimizely side from Simon. And then we'll wrap up with some best practices and some time for Q&A. But before we jump in, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. We're doing this webinar here on Teams, and if you don't use Microsoft Teams hour to hour and day to day, just a quick orientation. So we definitely want to answer as many questions as possible. The way to ask a question is up in the top ribbon in Teams. You'll see a Q&A function, and you can go ahead and submit a question into the Q&A anytime over the course of the webinar. And what we'll do is, as questions start to come in, we'll take a look at which ones are getting the most likes or the most upvotes. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it in. And if you see a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, go ahead and give it a like or an upvote so that we know which questions are sort of most relevant to the most people. But we'll take those questions at the end, and we should have 15, 20 minutes or so to do that. So in any event, let's go ahead and dive in. So I'll start us off here just covering a little bit of basic intro and background. So some of you remember, Google was in the optimization space for quite a long time, actually the best part of 20 years. And we've gone through a few different iterations of their products. Some of you might remember Website Optimizer. It's a fantastic product. It was really advanced, especially by the standard of its time. It was kind of complicated. It was a little finicky to implement and that sort of thing. And so the pendulum swung to something that was a bit more lightweight and easy to use and directly integrated into Google Analytics itself. That was Content Experiments. Then they came out with Google Optimize, but as a lot of you will know, Google Optimize is no longer with us. Google Optimize has gone the way of some other Google products over the years. And so while that can leave us wondering, how do I find an optimization platform to integrate with Google Analytics? I think the really good news is that we're moving to a new dynamic where rather than having Google basically try to manage their own optimization platform in-house, we're taking a step back and saying, hey, Google Analytics is really strong. Let's partner with an equally strong optimization platform in Optimizely and just make sure the two tools can integrate really seamlessly, right? So a bit of a different model where it's not going to be a native Google tool that you integrate with Google Analytics to drive things like A/B testing and personalization and that kind of stuff. So a little bit of a different model, but I think it's for the best over the long term because you're really getting the best of both worlds. And the reason this is so important, I know this probably goes without saying, but just on the next slide, Collin, what we're seeing is that the ability to drive optimization and to drive personalized experiences it's more important than ever. Here at Merkle, we cite this study a lot. I really like this one. We call it the expectation gap. But basically, the idea here is that most companies think they're already doing this, right? Like most companies think they've got personalization down and they're providing really tailored touch points with the brand across channels and all that. And the really interesting thing is that consumers just flat out disagree, right? And so there's this huge gap between the proportion of companies that think they're doing this well and the percentage of their customers who actually agree with them, right? And so, the implication here is that those of us that actually can start to orchestrate really personal experiences are really going to be able to fuel this kind of sustainable growth for the long term, right? So closing the expectation gap is more important than it's ever been because actually like this gap is getting bigger all the time. So that's a bit of the setup, right? There is definitely a mandate for brands to be able to drive personalization. And with GA4 and Optimizely working together, you'll be well equipped to do that. So with that as the kind of background and the introduction, let me hand it over to Simon from here, just to talk us through what the integration looks like at a high level and what it entails.
Sure, thank you, Nick. And so we obviously have some pre-packaged, pre-built integrations with GA4. And it goes without saying that that obviously can be enabled in terms of sending, in this case, audiences that have been pre-made or pre-described within GA4 across to Optimizely experimentation. Now, what it means is obviously there's less rework. And so you can use the existing audiences that have been made and then use them to form the baseline of exactly how you want to then run experiments and personalize to your audiences. And so exactly what it says on the screen, no more rebuilding of those segments. So it gives you access to not just having all of that rich audience-based data, those dimensions that you have, so all those characteristics, those attributes, but also things that we by default don't have visibility of. For example, things like age, looking at the ability to use gender, that kind of thing, where maybe you're enriching those audiences from some other data pools and data sources. So it means that you can run more targeted, more impactful experiments, and it means that you can pull them directly into the screen that you see here. So the key thing around that is obviously, as you can see, audiences shown in the drop down. You can then pick from those, and then you can obviously enrich those and add to those with other attributes, other behaviors, other things that are happening, and it enables you to run experiments and personalizations directly from that. So we're trying to make it easy. And so make it easy where you can use the existing data pools you have, data audiences, and then subsequently target appropriately. Now, the second step for this, of course, is actually not just taking data from GA4. It's also about what do I want to do when I've finished running the experiment, finished running my personalizations, and I then want to send it back to GA4 for targeting in terms of analytics. Maybe I want to do further reporting, further analysis, and I want to see exactly, well, what works and what doesn't work. And so as you can see from this screen here very clearly, we've decided to enable tracking, where tracking can then obviously send the event-based data directly across to the GA4 property. And that can then send across, well, you can obviously choose the different variations to export to GA4, check the boxes that you want, and then automatically send that data across. Now, as you can see very clearly, it says, well, look, what do you want to send? Do you want to associate those as unique IDs that surface the data associated with each individual user in the variant? But ultimately, it means you can analyze. So you can do lots and lots of examples where you can be much more expansive, define your analytics, and ultimately go on and deliver exceptional experiments in the future. So those are the two that we have, the key ones that we have, the push and the pull, as we say it, but obviously they can support any existing programs that you already have.
Perfect. Thanks, Simon. So to show what this looks like in action, just really quick, want to share a case study from an e-commerce client who Merkle Cardinal Path led through the Optimizely implementation and the GA4 integration back in September of last year. This is a perfect example that I think you'll get a lot of value out of, because this particular client, they were previously using both Google Optimize and Universal Analytics, and since migrating to both Optimizely and GA4, they've seen some really great results, including we've launched over 20 experiments in Optimizely and analyzed in GA4, resulting in 2 million in annualized incremental revenue, which is worth just over 10x ROI for their business. And so really excited about this for this particular client and others as well, because of the power of this integration we have here with Optimizely and GA4. So we've, now that we've kind of talked a little bit about the what, next we're going to go ahead and dive into what this looks like more in action. And so Calling back to what Simon shared earlier about the GA4 audience targeting integration, on my screen here, you'll see something that should look a little bit familiar. And so here we are in Optimizely in the audience builder. And once you've actually set up that integration, it's very, very easy to create these audiences in GA4. And so as you can see on the right there, you would just drag that audiences dimension into your audience conditions. And then you're going to be able to see all of your GA4 audiences right here in Optimizely. So once we select whichever audience we want to set up, we would just simply give it a name plus an optional description, and then we'd go ahead and save that down, and it's going to be ready for you, ready for you to use. And so on screen here next, just want to quickly show an example of what this would look like in the experiment at the experiment level. You can of course personalize experiences as well with these GA4 audiences, but here at our experiment on the left here, if you click into audiences, you will see here that you can just browse any of the audiences that you've created so far, including the one that we just set up based on that GA4 audience, and you would hit save, and it's as easy as that. So now that we've taken a look a little bit into what it looks like to actually target those GA4 audiences in Optimizely, we're going to go ahead and move on to what things look like in GA4, specifically how we're going to go ahead and analyze our experiment results in GA4. But first, I just want to preface that with where to find audiences in GA4 in case anyone's not familiar on this call. So in the admin section of GA4, underneath data display, we have this audience section, which I have highlighted on screen for you. This is where you'll find any of the audiences that you've created in GA4, plus any of the experiment variation audiences that have come from Optimizely. So when we talk about actually analyzing experiment performance, there's really going to be two ways that we can do that in GA4. The first is going to be through our standard reports, and the second is going to be in Explore reports. And so let's start off by taking a look at just an example standard report and setting that up. So if you've used GA4 or Universal Analytics before, you probably remember at the top, that's where we would go ahead and add a segment. Well, in GA4, we don't have segments here at the top in standard reports. Instead, we have what's called comparisons. And what we're going to do is at the top there, we're going to hit that add comparison button. That'll build up the comparison builder on the right rail. And this is where we're actually just going to define what those experiment variation audience names are. So for the dimension, we're going to want to select audience name followed by the exactly matches match type. And then for the value, it's simply going to be the name of those experiment variations. It's that easy. So once we go ahead and set that criteria, we'll go ahead and hit apply. And then on this next screen here, you can see what it would look like if we had two audiences applied to our standard report as comparisons. So in this example, let's just say we had, two variations, a control group and a treatment group in a test in Optimizely. We've activated that experiment. Those audiences have pushed to GA4. And now what we've done is we are looking at those audiences in a standard report. This particular report is the acquisition overview report. And we can see that we have an even split in traffic between this control and treatment group. Now, one of the nice things about this integration is that as you move on throughout your standard reports, so now I'm in a purchase journey checkout or a purchase journey report. If you have e-commerce tracking enabled, as you move throughout these reports, these audiences will stay, which is really nice because you don't have to rebuild them. So it can make it really easy to just answer some ad hoc questions, monitor experiment health, and things like that. So that's really it. It's super simple when it comes to applying these audiences to our standard reports. So next, I want to go ahead and share what it looks like when it comes to our Explore reports. So moving on to our next slide here, in GA4, if you haven't used Explore reports before, just know that we have a handful of different types of reports that we can choose from. I'd say the most common two that I use on a day-to-day basis with all of our clients is going to be freeform and funnel exploration, although there are some other great ones here as well, depending on what your use case is. So for today's example of, I'm going to go ahead and select a funnel exploration. So if I click that, we will now be able to set up segments within our Explore report to check in and see how our experiment is performing. So on the left rail here within this Explore report, we'll go ahead and click that plus icon. That's going to open up the segment builder because we want to compare how users who have been received the control group versus our treatment group are behaving. I'm going to go ahead and select a user-based segment. And then that's going to open up our segment builder here. From the dropdown, we're going to go ahead and select the experience variant ID dimension. One quick note here is if you do this integration there's a couple of different methods. I'm not going to go too much into the weeds on those today, but if you do end up going the GTM route, what you select will be a little bit different. What I'm showing here, this is the direct integration method, and this is the dimension you use for that. So just a quick caveat there. But once we do have that dimension defined, then we want to go ahead and specify, what we're including here. And so right here in this example, I have contains followed by the experiment variation ID number at any point in time. Now, before I go ahead and save this down, one other quick call that I have, and that is in Optimizely, by default, we have a setting that's enabled called mask descriptive names. And all that means is that if that setting is enabled, and it is enabled by default, so unless you uncheck that, but what that means is that when you run an experiment, it is going to push the experiment ID to GA4. And so that's the ID number you see here. And if you wanted to find that ID, you can easily find that at the experiment level under the API names section. Now, alternatively, what you can do is you can also disable that mask descriptive name setting in Optimizely so that you're actually able to pass your descriptive experiment names. So for example, perhaps you had a unique identifier for that experiment followed by, what the changes that you actually made, for example. If you went that route, all you'd have to do here is just start typing some text from that name, and you should get a drop-down list that you can go ahead and select from that list.
So just to add, Colin, obviously from what you just said is great. I mean, the example I used, of course, is exactly that. And furthermore, don't think that for the audience here that you're limited to just, A or B in terms of variations. Obviously, we showed a screenshot which had, a couple of variations and a control. There's no limitation to the number of variants or variations that you have in a particular experiment or personalization that you're doing. And as Colin said, it just appears in here. So think of all the exciting experiments, all the exciting tests that you'd like to run, and then indeed all of the different variations. And just to say, as a side note, we recently ran the Optimizely benchmark where we looked at over 1,000 organizations that were running experimentation programs with us. And it actually was that they got the best from running 4 variations in terms of the actual outputs, conversions, and the overall success of the experiments they were running. So think about that when you're designing your programs and your experiments.
Yeah, that's great, Simon. Thanks for adding that. And so this is a simplified example here. So we just have 2 segments created, one for our control and treatment group. But as Simon just said, some of those largest wins in the study they've done, they had 4 variations. So if we had 4 variations in this experiment on the screen here under segment comparisons, you would just create a separate segment for each of those 4 and then apply them across this report accordingly. Now, this report I'm looking at here, this is just a standard checkout flow that you would see with a typical e-commerce setup. And this is a great way to really dig into how that checkout flow is performing, especially if you're running experiments like within that flow. And what I love about analyzing experiments within Explore is that you're able to go a lot deeper. So we're not only able to see completion rate at each step, we're also able to see abandonment rate at each step. You can also drill down at device level and drill down looking at other dimensions as well. So highly recommend checking out the Explore reports if you haven't already. Now, one last pro tip I'll leave you with when using these Explore reports is to take advantage of this trended funnel here. In the previous slide I showed, we have this step by step, but it's of course aggregating all of those events together. And I really like this trended funnel because you get to see those events over time, which is really, really helpful when you're trying to establish causality. Oftentimes, things might not be what they see. They might not seem what they are on the surface, and this is a great way to see how that's performing over time. So just a little pro tip there. All right, so in summary, we've covered how to activate your GA4 audiences in Optimizely. We've taken a look at what that looks like in the UI, and then we've also covered how to analyze your Optimizely experiments in GA4, both looking at it from looking at standard your standard reports and your Explorer reports as well. And hopefully, as you can see, this is a really powerful integration, but it stays very, very simple at the same time, right? It's not a very complex process. It's really easy to navigate and use as well. So with that being said, I believe I'm going to hand it back to you, Simon, to talk a little bit more about what's coming up next.
Sure, thank you, Colin. And so with the next step, obviously, I wanted to highlight one particular integration that we have coming, which I know will resonate with lots of you in the audience, which is working directly with BigQuery. Now, we are enabling the BigQuery data share, and what that means is effectively we are using what's available for Google Cloud Analytics Hub for customers to enable and get access to near real-time raw data. Now, obviously that's beneficial because it may be that you are pooling together all of that different data that you want from different sources, maybe GA4 data, maybe our data, maybe other data that you want to use, and coalesce that into a single data repository for further analysis. And as it says very clearly, you can query your experiment data that comes across to BigQuery however you wish. So it means that you can then use that where it's part of your overall strategy, where experimentation or personalization is a piece of the overall thing that you're doing. And so it means that you can obviously combine those data sets, do your rich analysis, run your dashboards and build your queries, and then do the deep analysis. So feedback we got from customers that we've already spoken to about this said that we want to be able to do this to enrich and enhance how we analyze experiments and other data sources, but then subsequently then run future experiments, future personalizations better with all of that knowledge at hand. And so this is currently in beta. It's available for experimentation customers to be able to send this data. And if you're interested, please get in touch with us to basically take advantage of this functionality.
Fantastic. Thank you, Simon. Okay, so we're moving a little fast today, but that's okay. Hopefully we'll be able to get a little bit of time back. Before we get into our Q&A section, though, we thought it would be helpful for those on the call to share some just success factors that we've kind of noticed across organizations that have already made the jump and who are both up and running with GA4, not only up and running with it, but who are succeeding with it as well. And so that first success factor, it's really simple. It almost sounds kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised. And that's just to plan ahead, specifically, with reading the documentation, both on Optimizely and on Google side. I have to give Optimizely a ton of credit because their documentation is super up to date, very thorough, for all the different ways to go ahead and get this up and running. Also one other call under this umbrella would be that if you have GTM, you're going to need to complete the direct integration method plus the steps for sending events via GTM. But thankfully, as I said, Optimizely's documentation is up to date. You can find everything you need there. But yeah, so just make sure you plan ahead to make this a seamless transition as possible. The next thing would be to validate your integration. I know there's, from experience, there's a lot of excitement that comes with getting a new tool and wanting to get up and running. Nobody wants to sit idle for too long, not running tests and not running your personalizations while you're getting up and running. But I can't stress this one enough. But once you do get the integration set up, you need to validate it to make sure that those results are trustworthy. And the way we're going to do that is through an AA test. For those that aren't familiar with this is essentially where we're splitting traffic 50-50 between two identical versions of a page or a set of pages, ultimately to do a couple things. One, we want to make sure that we're properly passing data from Optimizely to GA4. And two, we want to make sure we understand how to interpret those results and three, that we're getting an even split. So again, I can't stress this one enough, but it is worth the time to slow down a little bit just to make sure that the team understands how all of this is working together, that we trust the results so that when we do get back up and running, we can be confident in our numbers here. All right, number 3 would be to understand how GA4's data model differs from universal analytics. This is a big one. Even if you're not testing and you are using GA4, this is another one that I think everyone should really spend some time on because GA4's data model is event-based, and it's completely different. It's rebuilt from the ground up, and so one of the biggest pain points that we've seen is some variances between UA and GA4, with certain metrics. And so it's normal to see those variances. And when you understand the data model and you know what's normal, it can really help, put you and your stakeholders at ease. So would really recommend understanding that data model. All right, and then last success criteria here is going to be making sure you align on a source of truth for experiment data. In the day and age we live today, there's data everywhere, and by integrating both Optimizely and GA4, you're going to be able to see how your experiments and personalizations are doing in both platforms. And so our recommendation is to use GA4 as your source of truth for reporting, but you're also going to be able to see how in Optimizely how your experiments doing if you're setting up different success metrics to monitor as the campaign is running. And one thing that's just one thing that we've seen is sometimes because we have the data is collected in a slightly different way between Optimizely and GA4 is if you have a certain variation that's winning, for example, you might see that variation is winning say by 5% in Optimizely and say 4% in GA4. It is some people may expect, well, hey, shouldn't those be the same? And they should not. You want them to be directionally the same, right? Like we would have definitely some cause for concern if one is pointing up and the other is pointing down. That would be a red flag. But generally, it's okay and expected to see a slight variance, with the data that we're seeing. But it's not really a problem because especially if you've aligned on what that source of truth is going to be, you will really know what you're looking at from the start, and you'll be able to get up and running and have minimal roadblocks from there. And so that's it in terms of success factors. And so I think from there I'm going to pass it to Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Collin. And some of the questions that are coming in are probably going to come back to you around some of the other lessons learned around the transition process and getting up and running with Optimizely. But before we get into the Q&A portion, just wanted to bookend this a little bit as a bit of a recap. So, we started out this session today talking about the expectation gap, right? And this dynamic where the vast majority of brands think that they've already got this nailed, right? That they're delivering personalized experiences that are relevant and useful across channels and across devices. And consumers beg to differ, right? The huge delta between how well brands think they're performing on this topic and how well their customers and consumers think they're performing. And so closing that gap is an imperative. And what we think is that there's a pretty simple 3-part recipe here, right? So in GA4, you're going to get all that really good granular measurement and data collection to figure out, where do you think you have some opportunities to improve, right? Is it in the checkout flow if you're a retailer? Is it somewhere in the in the sign up process if you're doing some kind of lead gen, right? Like where are you experiencing friction? Where are you losing people? And how can you start to build some data-driven hypotheses for how you can improve, right? With Optimizely, as you've seen here today, you're going to be able to target these really niche, relevant, specific audiences as you like, and then run anything from like simple A/B tests to more complex, more sophisticated personalization campaigns over time against those audiences. And we always like to point out, and I'll admit, we have a vested interest in pointing this out, but it's not just about the technology, right? It's about, enabling this and kind of having the glue to make everything stick together and work really well. So Collin's team is really good at providing the implementation and integration services to help you kind of get off to a fast start out of the gate. Collin's team, he's too humble to mention it, but they can also help you with things like experiment design and results analysis, and just a wide variety of other kinds of professional services that help you kind of get the most out of the investment that you're making in the tools themselves. So again, we want to be able to close this expectation gap, and we see this as like a pretty simple kind of 3-ingredient recipe here. But with that, I think, yeah, like Collin said, we're pacing here pretty quickly, so we can go ahead and segue into the Q&A. Do get your questions in while we have Collin and Simon here with us today. But one question that we can start with, just kind of going in order really here, was around Collin. You had referenced this idea of like the masked descriptive name. So for organizations that choose to use that option and they are using masked descriptive names, will there be different unique IDs for every variation in an Optimizely experiment that's going on? I would think that there would be, but can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, and thanks for the question. So yeah, those IDs are going to be unique, both at the experiment level and then also at the variation level. And I don't have a visual to show you, but if you were to go into your experiment in Optimizely, there's a section on the left rail called API names. And if you open that up, you can actually see what would be passed from Optimizely to GA4. So any clients that I work with, anytime I'm building segments or anything like that, that's where I'll go in. I'll just copy and paste that API name for that variation from Optimizely, and then I'll just paste it into the segment builder in GA4, and that's all you have to do.
Got it. Thanks, Collin. Another question that was posed to me by some of the folks that I can see who are on the call today, so I'll kind of ask on their behalf, was, a big part of the premise here is that a lot of organizations were using Google Optimize, and not everyone has transitioned to an alternative solution like an Optimizely. And question that I get almost on a sort of weekly basis is, for organizations that had been familiar with Google Optimize and felt comfortable using it, what are some of the biggest differences between Google Optimize and Optimizely? And maybe Collin and Simon, I'll come to you in turn to comment on that. But Collin, just to start with you, clients that you're working with day to day, what are some of the big differences that they're seeing working with Google Optimize in the past compared to working with Optimizely today?
Yeah, I mean there's a lot of differences, but I would say off the top of my head, just power and performance is going to be the two big things that clients realize. I mean, Optimize was great for what it was, but anyone that has since made the transition with us, I think they've realized it's kind of like going from driving maybe. And no disrespect on the Toyota Camry, but it's kind of like going from the Camry to perhaps the Benz or the BMW or a Ferrari or something like that. You just get a lot more power. It's enterprise level. But at the same time, because it's enterprise level, experiment and personalization, it doesn't become more complicated. It's just as easy to use, if not even easier, in my opinion. And also, when you actually talk about performance, like a little bit more specifically, the snippet, very low weight. So one of the big problems that I saw with clients using Google Optimize is that pesky flicker that you can see sometimes, which is not a great experience. We don't have that with Optimizely snippets. So those are a couple things off the top of my head. I'm sure Simon's got a list as well. If you care to add to that, Simon.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's two things. I'll do the same. I'll give two. And so, first and foremost, quite a lot of organizations speak to me about the support for single-page apps. And so we have support for things like dynamic selectors, the ability to work with basically any way in which someone has built their experience to then allow them to personalize or experiment. And that flexibility is produced without, as you've already said, Collin, without interrupting or let's say breaking how the page or the experience is running. And that's huge. So it means that people have complete flexibility to personalize or tailor their experiments, their tests, their personalizations as they see fit. And so that's the first and foremost thing. The second actually is our ecosystem, actually, where we have quite, I'd say, an advanced ecosystem of integrations that we offer, where it not just GA4, obviously today you've heard about that, but let's just say other organizations, whether it's working with audiences from other environments, from CDPs, working with other institutions, maybe where they've got pools of data or analytics or whatever that might be, to analyze where experiments aren't running maybe the way that they should be. And you want to use tools like Content Square, for example, or Quantum Metric or Full Story to get more of an experience analytics piece. We have pre-baked and pre-built integrations that support that rich analytics piece. Should you want to understand maybe why there's a rage click going on a particular experience, or you want to understand why my customers aren't converting, using the data from GA4, from us, but also saying, well, what's the behavior behind this? And can I see more information to support my hypothesis? And so there too, but there are many others. And I think it just goes to show that we have an enterprise grade platform, and that's a testament to what we can see today.
Thanks, Colin and Simon. Another question coming in is around, Colin, sort of the point that you made around aligning on what the source of truth for experiment performance is before you jump in with both feet, right? So that you sort of know which tool you're relying on to do things like, for example, declare a winner. So one of the questions was basically, how do we know? And this is a common question, and it's been a common question for as long as experimentation online has been happening. How do we know when statistical significance has been achieved? Do we look for that in Optimizely? Do we look for that in GA4? Where do we go to know kind of, hey, this experiment has a winner, and we can conclude the experiment?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the great things about Optimizely is that they have this fantastic, stats engine that powers the experimentation. So to answer the question, I guess, with the short answer would be, you can find that in Optimizely. So when you run an experiment, you'll actually see everything you need to see in the results section. So you can get that confidence interval. You can see, what percentage statistical significance you're at with an estimate of how many visitors are remaining. So, for me personally, I like to use that, on like day-to-day monitoring, just kind of see how we're chugging along. But in its current state with GA4, you're not going to see that statistical significance out of the box in GA4. So, a lot of times what I'll do from there is just, plug that into just run a simple t-test and just calculate significance with, there's tons of these calculators out there. You can just do it that way. But that's kind of the nice thing about using these two tools together is that you have, Optimizely on one hand to run these experiments and deliver these personalized experiences. You can monitor them in real time. And then, more so as we get towards the end of actually concluding our activity and it's time to do like a deeper dive analysis in GA4, we can then come over there to do it and then analyze things accordingly. So I would love to see some sort of like a built-in thing in GA4 in the future, but that's kind of where we're at current state. And if we have any other questions about that, would always be happy to dive deeper into process, offline as well.
And just to add as well, obviously, for those of you not familiar with what stat sig or significance means, it's basically measuring how unusual, say, A/B test results would be if there was no difference between the variation and the baseline. And so the difference in lift was due to random chance alone. And so just to give you a couple of examples of where we do that, obviously the question online, but for anyone else that's interested, we don't declare a variation as significant or update the confidence interval, as Colin's mentioned, until the experiment meets particular criteria for visitors and conversions. So criteria are different for experiments using numeric or binary metrics. So I think Colin mentioned about metrics earlier. Now, it could be numeric metrics like revenue. They don't require a particular number of conversions, but require 100 visitors or sessions in the variations, for example. Whereas binary metrics require at least 100 visitors or sessions and 25 conversions in the variation. And the baseline before a winner can then be declared. And so what it means is, and what Colin said quite rightly earlier, is define your metrics so you know what good looks like and what significance can look like. And then you can then infer from that what that may mean in terms of getting towards that level of confidence that you desire. So we have a proprietary engine that we built as an organization which supports this to do lots of exciting analysis. And I think the team would be happy to support you with that.
Thanks both. Lots of good questions coming in, so we're going to keep you both on your toes here. Here's one that I think, Colin, probably I'll direct at you at least to start, but a question about sort of keeping the integration between Optimizely and GA4 healthy. And I think the underlying concern here is one that I've heard from folks kind of day to day as well, and that is, given that the integration is audience based, and audiences, for those of you who don't know, in GA4 are a finite resource, right? You don't have unlimited access to audiences. So in the free product, in the free version of GA4, for example, you can use up to 100 different audiences concurrently. There's a much higher limit in the 360 product. But Colin, I think what the question is sort of ultimately, if we're using this integration over time, am I going to kind of jam up my audiences in GA4 to where I've used up all 100 and now I can't use any more? Especially because there's a question around things like, is there one audience for every variation in a test or in an experiment, or is there one audience for the entire activity? So, Colin, I think you kind of hear what the underlying concern is. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, the short answer would be there should be no concern about that, simply because in Optimizely, when you have an experiment that's live, yes, that will be pushed to GA4 as an audience. When you pause that experiment, so it's still visible in your project folder, that audience will still remain in GA4 as well. But the moment you archive that audience, it'll automatically be removed from GA4. So that would then, take it down and you wouldn't hit that limit. And I think there was also a concern, or part of that question was, if how the audiences are sent. Is it sent as like an entire experiment, or is it sent at the variation level? It's sent at the variation level. So if you have an experiment with 4 variations and you press, you launch it today, pretty instantaneously you're going to get 4 new audiences populating in GA4. I mean, it's like near real time that'll be pushed. But the second that you pause and archive that experiment in Optimizely, it's going to drop off in GA4. And I think that was, and Simon, correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume that's an intentional design, knowing some of those concerns about audience limits.
Correct. It is. Yeah, absolutely.
So, Colin, to summarize, it sounds like basically once you're done, not only like running the activity, but then analyzing the activity in GA4, you can archive those audiences and essentially like free up those slots. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay. So there's no sort of cumulative drain on your audiences. But good question, and one that I've heard before. So glad to know the answer. Now this next one, we could genuinely probably spend an hour talking about this. So I love this question from Mariah. Mariah is asking, beyond sample size, like having a sufficient sample size that you can feel confident in the results that you're seeing, beyond sample size, what other validity issues should we watch out for? So I know, for example, one that I hear pretty often is not just about having a large enough sample size and having an even split across your variations, but understanding the composition of the audience across variations, right? And is it a representative example? Is it a similar composition? Or do you have, for some reason, some kind of bias sort of leaking into your variations, where the audiences that are seeing each variation, for instance, are not actually sort of equally representative? So I don't know if that's a specific rabbit hole that we want to go down, but let me zoom us back out and just ask both of you. Maybe Simon, I'll start with you. What other kinds of sort of validity issues should we watch out for, and what can we do with either Optimizely or GA4 to perhaps like monitor those or correct for those as needed?
So in terms of the kind of things that we do, actually, we recommend that when looking at, as it says, beyond sample size, we obviously have tools, as you mentioned, to do that. So therefore, make sure that the sample size to begin with actually is what you expect to be then testing against or experimenting against. Then subsequently, I think Colin touched on this earlier, so then therefore use the 2 data sources together from a reporting perspective to know actually what valid or what expected behavior looks like, or indeed expected reporting and analysis looks like. So we actually recommend to actually use all the tools at hand, in this case obviously GA4, but obviously optimize these experimentation tool set to then understand exactly, well, what does good look like and what expected behavior look like. But typically, to be frank, we normally start with the sample size piece, so I know effectively how to design the experiments correctly, so I know what the experiments should look like and should behave like, to be honest. And then we then use muscle memory in terms of actually what have we done historically that looks and feels similar, to then subsequently know what the expected behavior should be in the future. Colin, did you want to obviously add or say anything different?
Yeah, I mean, I think that pretty much covers it. But a couple things I can add to that. One would be, like I touched on this a little bit earlier, but anytime you believe you've reached statistical significance, you're ready to call it a winner. Before we actually go ahead and like make that final decision, I like to do a deeper analysis to make sure that that's actually that it's actually ready and time to call it. So earlier I showed, how we can trend that out. And it's, one thing I've seen before is, and then somewhat frequently is, you may reach statistical significance in aggregate, but then when you actually look at that conversion rate over time, you kind of see, it's up and then it's down, and it's up and down. And at the end of the day, if we're really trying to establish a causal connection between the change we made and the outcome, we should be able to see it from multiple angles. And so I like to just, go deeper on that. I also like to, Simon mentioned using all the tools in the toolbox. You know, in Optimizely, there's a lot of integration capabilities. You know, one that I love in particular is with Content Square. There's other UX tools out there as well, but you know, if you integrate with a tool like Content Square, you can actually do a side-by-side comparison, you know, on those pages, and you can kind of bring in that qualitative data to the picture, and really see that, like, are we did this change actually lead to the impact that we're seeing on, you know, in GA4 and Optimizely? If so, are there any, you know, is it at the expense of something else? You know, so I just really like to take advantage of all those tools that we have in the toolbox to ensure that we're, you know, scrutinizing things and just keeping ourselves accountable when calling winners on tests.
And Nick, I love that, the fact that I think you said about rage clicks. I think whoever coined that term literally will be a very rich person. So I think it's one of the key topics you mentioned, Colin, around rage clicks. Is Content Square is great, as are quantum metric and obviously full story as tools, as examples, analyzing points of frustration. So I think that's a great example of something you may want to do for your analysis once you're building out your experiments.
A couple other questions that came in that I think I actually want to combine them because I think they're at least somewhat sort of relevant to each other. So there was a question about whether we think, you know, A/B testing or perhaps multivariate experiments is better for images specifically. And then there was a question also about just basically managing testing in an environment where there's maybe relatively lower traffic, right? We know that can be a challenge in terms of accruing sort of critical mass and that sort of thing. So I'll start this one off, actually. I'll steal the microphone here for a second and just begin to answer this, but then Colin and Simon, I'll come to each of you. So the first thing I would say is there was a question around, you know, is multivariate or A/B testing better? And it's always a really tricky question to answer because, you know, there's not necessarily one right answer to that. But what I would encourage you to think about is, you know, choosing the right testing methods that just make sense in your context as a business. So for example, like a simple A/B test where you have a control experience and one variant, you lose out on some perhaps sophistication there, right? And some granularity into what the true kind of optimal performance might be. But because you only have two variants, if you are a relatively kind of low traffic site or app, for example, now you've got a test that's more likely to give you results that are insightful, that you can learn something from. And so I'd shy away from saying, you know, one method of testing is better or worse than another, but I would say it's worth thinking about, you know, can your site handle a 5 by 5 by 5 multivariate experiment? If so, great. Like, you're going to learn a lot by doing that, right? But maybe a kind of a more simple A/B test is more appropriate given things like traffic volume and that sort of thing. So to get a little bit more advanced and kind of beyond what I can answer, so throw me a lifeline here. There was a question around basically, more specifically, things like variable metrics and binary metrics, and which one of those might sort of validate more quickly on a low traffic site. So Colin or Simon, I'll let you kind of arm wrestle for this one in terms of who wants to take this one around variable metrics versus binary metrics and how those validate.
You go first, Colin, and I'll add.
Yeah. So what is the question exactly there, Nick?
Basically, yeah.
Low traffic site with,
when you're testing on a site with lower traffic, Colin,
yeah,
would a variable metric be able to kind of validate more quickly than a binary metric? And is there anything else that we should know about kind of interpreting results for tests in a lower traffic environment?
Okay. Yeah, I'll try to answer that one as best I can. I mean, low traffic. Like, at the end of the day, traffic is the lifeblood of actually doing, you know, A/B testing, multivariate testing, site testing in general. So, you know, when you have low traffic, you know, you have to be more selective with what you do. So I think part of that question was, is it better to do, you know, A/B versus multivariate? So I mean, it's going to be really tough to reach statistical significance in a reasonable amount of time with low traffic sites. It just is. So, I tend to lead towards, starting small, especially if you're trying to get the gears turning in your program, and then leveling up from there. Another thing I'll say is that, with low traffic sites, A/B testing is not the only way to test. There's a lot of different ways that you can test. You can, do voice of customer testing. You can do user testing. You can do usability testing. Like, testing is kind of a broad term, and here at Merkle Cardinal Path, we do all of that. And a lot of times when we have clients that have, low traffic issues, or they might have something else that they want to learn that's not, a good design for either an A/B test or, your traditional type of like site test. There's other methods that you can use as well.
So I can add to that, obviously, with one key piece of information, which is, of course, a lot of times we have the stats accelerator, which enables you to get quicker to an opinion in terms of how well is that experiment performing. So as you can tell by the name of it, what it does, it manipulates traffic to minimize the time it takes or the effort made to get to static. So that can help you in terms of actually sites. Well, two use cases, actually. One where you are wanting to get to an opinion much faster. So therefore, you're running the experiment for a shorter time frame and you want to get to that opinion much more quickly. And secondly, in combination with that, it may be that you haven't got to the desired traffic you wish. And so this will effectively manipulate the traffic and then allow you to then get to an opinion much faster. So it monitors ongoing experiments, uses machine learning to adjust the traffic distribution among the different variations. And so it shows more visitors variations with a better chance of getting to stat-sig. So the idea is to get you to an opinion much faster. So it could be that you use what Colin's mentioned, or indeed use the accelerator to get to that opinion too. I think you're on mute, Nick, as well.
It's my first time doing an online meeting. Thanks, Simon. No, I was just saying, keep an eye on the Q&A here. I think we've answered all the questions that have come in. So maybe we can give everyone 8 or 9 minutes back. But what I would say is, as you go, think about the expectations gap. Think about how well situated your organization is to close that gap, so that you're actually delivering what maybe you think you're delivering now, but that consumers are demanding more of all of us from. Hopefully what you've seen today is that between GA4 and Optimizely, you have the sort of tools in the toolkit that you need to close the expectation gap, and we would love to help you with that. So if you have questions around implementation, integration, experiment design, results analysis, all that kind of stuff, do reach out and get in touch with us, because those are all things that we would be happy to help you with. But with that, we know you have next meetings and dog walks and lunches and all that to get to. So go and do that. But thanks again for joining us. And thanks for all the really good participation as well in the Q&A. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.